Do you love homes that combine vintage charm with an updated style? Then I think you're going to enjoy today's video. We'll be transforming 10 thrift store finds using a perfect blend of old and new. We'll refresh vintage finds with modern elements and infuse newer items with vintage character. So, if you like home decor that combines the classic with the contemporary, let's get started.
I'm sure these copper-colored medallions were high-end decor in the 1970s, and although they're nice enough, I wanted to give them an update. First, I popped off the medallions. The first two came off easily, but the third one pulled up some of the black velvet background. Next, I unscrewed the frames and removed them so I could recover the wood strip. I applied spray adhesive to the front and sides of the wood strip and centered a piece of Dollar Tree green velvet ribbon over it, folding the edges over to the side and trimming off the excess. The bottom of the wood strip was cut in a dovetail design, so I had to cut some additional small pieces of ribbon to cover the inside edges. The frames were just painted wood, and I wasn't fond of the copper color, so I brushed gold rubbin buff over the frames and then reattached them to the wood strip. The medallions weren't real copper either, so I wanted to make them look like a plaster relief, which is so popular right now. I painted them with an off-white chalk paint and lightly distressed them with sandpaper. Before reattaching the medallions to the frames, I cleaned the black velvet background with some masking tape. Then I used hot glue to adhere the medallions to the black velvet. And for a finishing touch, I tied a black ribbon around the finial. This vintage brass candle stand likely had a glass hurricane globe at one time, which I could have replaced. But to give it an updated look, I'm going to add a hanging wire basket instead. First, I removed the hanging hardware from the basket, and I tried to remove the ring on the tip of the basket, but I needed to take it outside and use my angle grinder to remove the ring. Then to replace it, I used Gorilla Glue to attach a cabinet knob to the tip. Once the glue was dry, I sprayed the basket and knob with some gold metallic spray paint. To knock off some of the sheen and to better match the brass candle stand, I brushed the basket with some antiquing wax, wiping off the excess with a paper towel. Rather than adding a candle, I wanted to add some faux greenery. So I pushed some styrofoam into the center hole. The wire basket didn't allow much room for greenery stems, so I just added a few small ivy vines. Then I hot glued moss to fill in the center of the candle stand. Once the basket was sitting firmly on top of the brass base, I pulled some of the ivy leaves through the holes to the outside of the basket. This mantel clock was decidedly not antique or even vintage, but I thought we could make it look old and much more interesting. First, I removed all of the clock hands and the nut holding the battery box in place. I carefully put everything back together in the correct order so that I can reuse this on some future project. Next, I grabbed my hammer and began pounding out a hole through the clock face. Once I was happy with the size of the hole, I removed the screws and glass in the clock door and took the clock outside and gave it a couple coats of leafy green spray paint. I used Modern Masters rust effect on the hardware parts to make them look old. First, you paint them with 2 coats of the rusty orange primer, then you paint them with 2 coats of the iron paint, and finally you spray them with the rust activator. To make the green paint look old, first I used a sanding block to distress it, and then I brushed on a coat of antiquing wax, dabbing away the excess. To create a vintage-looking background for the clock face, I printed out an image of vintage wallpaper on cardstock and used glue stick to adhere it over the original clock face. Then I used a utility knife to cut the paper covering the hole that I had hammered out. Next, I printed out a vintage clock face image on cardstock and glued it in the center of the wallpaper. And once again, I cut through the paper to reveal my hammered out hole. As you probably guessed, I wanted to put something behind the hole, and the thing that seemed to fit best was a bird. First, I needed to hot glue a small wood block on the back side to serve as a riser for the bird, so his head would poke through the hole. To fill the small lower hole, I glued a piece of styrofoam next to the wood block and glued moss on the front of both to conceal them. Then I stuck a few greenery stems into the styrofoam. I also hot glued some Spanish moss and tiny flowers on the back side of the clock face next to the bird. Then I began reassembling the clock, putting the glass back in the door and covering the back panel with a piece of scrapbook paper to conceal the hole. And finally, I reattached the now very rusty looking handle. If there was any doubt, the incredibly musty smell inside this trunk was proof that this was a genuinely vintage item. The interior had been covered with something like wallpaper, and it was that paper that smelled so bad, so I immediately ripped it all out. I was going to use the trunk to house my cat's litter box, so I just needed to trim one of the edges of the plastic box to get it to fit inside. To give it a fun update, I decided to decorate it with some rub-on transfers. A sweet viewer had told me about a William Morris rub-on transfer on Etsy, and I immediately ordered it. Unfortunately, I ruined one of the 2 pieces taking it out of the mailing tube. So I decided to use the damaged piece on the trunk. I was surprised due to the lid's condition, but the transfer adhered perfectly. To make the transfer look as old as the trunk, I distressed it with sandpaper and scraped at the edges with a razor blade. I had a scrap piece left over, so I decided to add a few designs to the front of the trunk too. This wood bowl says Brotchen or bread roll on the side. And rather than sanding off the word and designs, I just painted over them with moss green chalk paint. I also painted the scallop design along the upper edge. For a modern update, let's add a wood rod through the handles so it can be used for something other than bread. I found one in my wood stash and painted it green and cut it to fit. When the paint was dry, I distressed the wood rod and the upper edge of the wood bowl. I didn't sand over the main section because I didn't want to highlight the underlying design. Instead, to further disguise the design, I cut up the remaining scraps from the William Morris rub-on transfer that I had used on the trunk and applied them in a continuous pattern all the way around the bowl. Once adhered, I used fine grit sandpaper to lightly distress the transfers. Then I applied a protective coat of clear wax to the outside of the bowl and to the green rod. I thought this would make a great sewing basket or twine dispenser for the laundry room. This toothbrush holder is obviously not an antique, but the blue and white design could easily blend in with a collection of vintage chinoiserie, especially if we fill it with something old like these brushes and an old pair of scissors. Add some faux greenery stems to the largest hole, and this will look super cute sitting out on a kitchen or laundry room shelf. Here's another item that I'm sure was very stylish in the 70s. This wall sconce was made from a heavy metal and painted in a gold color that would have matched the appliances in my childhood home. So I spray painted it with a modern green color. I removed the candle cup so that I could more easily apply a rub-on transfer of small flowers and ivy. Although the transfer adhered easily, due to the irregular surface, it had lots of cracks in it. So once again, I distressed it with sandpaper, which brought out some of the original paint. Hoping to make those spots look more gold than yellow, I brushed antiquing wax over the sconce, wiping away the excess. Then I found a small glass globe that I had previously removed from something, and it fit nicely on the candle cup, so I hot glued it in place. To fill the globe, I took a dried mushroom from my yard and trimmed it to fit inside the glass globe. The mushroom looks and feels like soft bark. I hot glued some moss on the top concave surface, and then I hot glued a few stems of greenery into the moss. I pushed the mushroom into the glass globe and squeezed some hot glue on the bottom to hold it in place. I liked how the yellow flowers picked up on the yellow paint, and so I looked for a yellow rub-on transfer to add to the sconce, but all I could find was a pale yellow butterfly, which I applied over the pink flowers. Then I distressed and waxed it to match the rest of the sconce. This modern wine rack caught my eye at the thrift store because it was built in a house shape. I started this makeover by spray painting the wine rack pale green and heavily distressing it with an orbital sander. To create a base for the wine rack, I pulled out some vintage pale green baseboard from my stash. I don't have a great miter saw, and I'm not good at angled cuts. So through much trial and error, I was able to cut 45-degree angles at the ends of my front piece and on the front edge of my two side pieces. However, I decided to do straight cuts on the back corners. I just barely had enough baseboard to go around the wine rack, so I couldn't risk making a mistake with those angled cuts. To adhere the baseboard, I used wood glue in the corners and along the upper edge, adding brad nails where I could. Once I took it inside, I ran a bead of caulk along the top of the baseboard and in the corners to fill in any gaps and to further adhere the pieces together. I painted over the cut edges of wood with some light green chalk paint that ended up being a nearly perfect color match. To lighten up the green paint on the wine rack, I brushed white wax over all of the lattice pieces and dabbed away the excess. Then, to give it a dirtier, more aged appearance like the baseboard pieces, I brushed on some watered-down antiquing wax and dabbed away most of it with an old cloth. Let me know, do you think I should have removed the X on the base of the wine rack and added a solid piece of wood to the bottom of the baseboard? This vintage gravy boat is too cute to be shut away in a cabinet, so let's turn it into something else. I found this bird candle stand in my stash and cut down the ends of the plastic log so that I could hot glue it inside the gravy boat. I filled in around the candle stand with styrofoam and used a little hot glue to secure it in place. By chance, I had a few pansies just like those pictured on the side of the gravy boat. I cut the stems apart and added them to the styrofoam. Then I filled in around the flowers with some additional greenery and covered the styrofoam with Spanish moss. As a finishing touch, I trimmed around a Dollar Tree butterfly sticker and hot glued it to the candle stand. This thrift store find was someone else's DIY project. They had already used vintage tin tiles to create a contemporary wall basket. All it needed was some fresh paint to coordinate with my kitchen decor. I chose a dark blue. When the paint was dry, I distressed it with fine grit sandpaper to bring out the designs. Then I first applied a coat of white wax, wiping away the excess. And then I applied some antiquing wax, wiping away the excess. I like this color much better than the original red. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope you'll let me know which of today's projects was your favorite. And if you enjoy thrift flips like these, here's another video I think you'll like. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye for now.